Good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to the last session on Europe. Europe at the rendezvous of history. Europe was heavily discussed in the last 3 days. We discussed it. Olivier Blanchard mentioned that, well, described the situation as follows. He said we fell into a hole, and now we have to know at what speed we'll get out of it. Ursula von der Leyen yesterday said that we will pull out of it. We will pull out of the crisis stronger and more united. So we'll discuss that European moment and see how we can actually be stronger and more united. Now, to answer the questions and talk about the subject today, we have in Stockholm, remote, Margot WALLSTRÖM. Good afternoon, Madam. Former Minister of Foreign Affairs in Sweden. Thank you very much for your presence, even remotely. Here in the studio, Valérie RABAULT, the member of the European Parliament, Guillaume, FAURY, manager of Airbus, CEO of Airbus, and Yves, the patron of Amundi. And then we have Françoise from the Cercle, économistes. So the way we're going to proceed is very simple. Françoise BENHAMOU will kick off the debate and set the principles, and then each member of the roundtable will deliver his or her idea of Europe for a couple of minutes, and then we'll have a discussion among ourselves with your questions, of course, which I'm receiving on a pad, which is here, and which I will pass on to our participants. Françoise, you have the floor. Thank you, Sylvie. Good afternoon to all. We are going to pull out of it. This is the title of the rencontre, at least the subtitle. And I'd like to come up with an hypothesis. We cannot pull out of it, us Europeans, only by going back to the values which were the basis of European foundation. Now, allow me to give you a text from Stefan Zweig dating back to 1934, the unification of Europe. The European idea is not a primary feeling like patriotic feeling or belonging to other people. It's not original, and it is the fruit slowly mature of a higher thinking. National thinking may think on the teaching, army, uniform, national anthems, insignia, regional language. It has the protection of the state and can actually stir the masses. Whereas here, for the European idea, we only have words and text. If we have ideas to have real effect, we have to make it visible and convincing for the wider circle. So, of course, then European construction has moved on. So why come back to Stefan Zweig? Well, simply because this European man would give us in few words what is the basic, the foundation of Europe, the needs for value, common value, references, institutions that convey such values, and the need to convince people. Now, where do we stand today about this joint project? Well, lots could be said, but Europe is divided for the main orientations, divided with economic and political cultures which are different, with the risk of major attack to democracy in some countries. The economic convergence which should result from the setting up of the Eurozone did not take place, and fueled by the depths of the actual crisis, divergences may occur. But Europe is still here. We see a strong sign in the continuity of institutions, of course, sometimes blamed. But anyway, in its ability to reinvent itself. And this is why the European Union was able to renounce, at least for a while, to some of its dogmas. And I'm referring to the Stability Agreement, or Pact of Stability. So we hope a strong movement with the 750 million euro loan. And that will make it possible to support economies through donations, loans, subsidies, through loans and guarantees to banking institutions. Ursula von der Leyen said during our meeting, the sectorial and national allocation of such sums is not finished. The principle has been approved, and it's a great progress in terms of solidarity. And this idea, €1 invested in a country is €1 invested for all. So we see other signs of solidarity. If some countries have prohibited the exportation of masks and closed their borders, well, solidarity in view of the pandemics finally took place, and patients and sanitary equipment were going from one country to another. So there has been also transfer in the community budget, or when there was an agreement to pool or aggregate debt. Union want to be stronger, less naive versus the other power. China has a global ambition, as Angela Merkel said. The United States are somewhat shrinking back into their border, and others are threatening us with hybrid wars. So Europe wants to fight for its value and sovereignty, for human rights, to secure supply chain, to submit foreign companies to rules similar to those applied to European companies, or to respond to the might of the GAFAM. Europe was not always up to the expectations, yet we're living a European moment, as Sylvie said. Even though at the time when we opened the German presidency of the Union, so this is when we should advocate for Europe. Otherwise, we run the worst. Enlightenment was the heart of the idea of Europe in the 17th century. We have to make forward in the progress prompted by the Les Lumières, so that Europe can assert itself in one of the worst crises since the 30s. Let me mention Francis Wolff and its advocacy for universalist ideas should regain their mobilizing and critical power against the dictator of emotion and opinions. Well, we have to argue for scientific reason against the empire of identity. We have to find the world of identity, similarity, and we have to model of growth which is respectful of common good and of the environment, as mentioned this morning, and we have to discuss it today. So we'll now turn to Margot WALLSTRÖM. Thank you very much again for your presence this afternoon. Now, when you were running the you were in charge of Sweden foreign policy, you applied a feminist value. Values is something dear to you. Now, tell us how in the world today, this rather unstable and complex world, how could we do a security foreign policy that would take into account European values? I will say a few words in French first. Good afternoon to all, and thank you very much for your very kind invitation. It is a great honor and a real pleasure to be part of this discussion, because I'm sure this topic is fundamental and useful. Now, of course, if you don't mind, I would rather be in Paris or Aix-en-Provence next time. I hope I'll be able to join you. So I will continue in English if you don't mind.
I promised to say something about maybe first and foremost security and democracy, because right now we are in the midst of this unprecedented crisis that affects us at all levels in society. Every sector, from, of course, the economy to nature to health to everything in our daily lives. And it is not over yet. And I read an article that said that there are three defining features of this pandemic: uncertainty, inequality, and humbleness. And I found that very interesting. Of course, uncertainty, that's for sure. And we can see that it comes out also as a longing for old times, old systems that we could rely on, or maybe going back to something, which I think is of course totally unrealistic. But also inequality, because this virus and its effects actually discriminates. between rich and poor, between ages, between regions and generations as well, between men and women. This will have an impact later on. But this article also mentioned humbleness, because it's about mankind's decreasing control of its destiny and nature. Because remember, just 1 year ago, we talked a lot about artificial intelligence. We were talking about new technology, and of course in the context of climate change, what would that bring in terms of changes? And now we are back to finding enough cotton masks or toilet paper to people. That's how it sort of turned out in real life. And when I now see so many new sort of mottos and slogans for what we have to do, I think we have to go back to the very practical things. And if we think of Europe, I really believe that we have to talk about, as somebody called it, the entity with a stubborn heartbeat. Europe is an entity with a stubborn heartbeat. We cannot think it away. We have to use our European cooperation to the best. I think we will be affected when it comes to security in Europe. I think countries now reflect on civil preparedness and civil defense matters. I think that we will have to define security in a new way and take this into account because it affects us, and it's only now that the United Nations Security Council has accepted sort of the effects on the world of the pandemic. I think that we have to look properly also at our priorities. Do you really think that the nuclear power nations will use as much money to modernize nuclear weapons in the future when money will be needed everywhere else? Is that the right way to go? And we know now that the world needs cooperation. So these are just a few of the factors that will influence the discussion also within the European Union. And of course, we can see that democracy, if I just shortly say something about that as well, we can see that democracy and the democratic parameters and fundamentals come under attack when this pandemic hits. And I really think that the European Union, the member states, have to come together to defend the core values and ideals of the European Union. And we will have to do that in a completely different situation geopolitically, because we no longer have only two superpowers, but now China will appear on the scene, much more self-confident and I would say forward-leaning China. So it changes everything. But we have to defend multilateralism, not only with words, but also in what we do and how we come together and work together. And we will have to involve women, both when it comes to the whole security policy and I would say also for democracy and the sake of democracy, because we know that more women means more peace. And this has also been demonstrated by this crisis, that it affects women and men differently, but the role of women as well. So we have to fight inequalities to be able and tackle inequalities, to be able to tackle the huge challenges that we see in front of us, not least that we grow older everywhere in Europe as well, and we have to take care of our elders, and that is something we also have in common. So a lot of challenges and problems as it is today, but Europe is the way forward. We see that we cannot do it without coming together, without the European cooperation and an international cooperation as well.
Thank you for all the leads you're putting in this discussion. Valérie RABAULT, good morning, good afternoon, sorry. Thank you for being with us. You're a member of the Finance Commission in the National Parliament. You know Europe, you know Germany, more specifically. How do you see Europe overcoming the crisis? Is it by advocating for its value and interest? Joseph Borrell said to the representative, I think two steps are needed to be crossed, one short-term step and one step which lead to the evolution of what we are. Europe was built on values, and it has to move on the offensive mode to advocate and fight for its interests. And on behalf of the values, Europe didn't want to fight for its interests. We might pay cash for that. So first step, we want to succeed the saving plan for the European countries. The German Chancellor said two words. She said, our red line should be solidarity and sovereignty. Well, even though I don't belong to a political school, I agree with her. If the recovery plan or rebound or support or whatever plan to pull out of the crisis is not implemented, it will mean that there is no longer any European solidarity. Of course, we talk about 750 million euros. 500 would be loans, 250 that would be support, subsidies to several projects. It's huge. It's huge, by the way. I know that right now we handle billions as we would handle apples and pears, but, you know, it's huge. It's never been done. The European Union will loan its credibility to borrow and then transpose and loan this money to the member states, especially those which need it most, with the lowest budgetary resources. I know Europe always grew in crisis. We saw it in 2008. We saw it was built following a huge crisis, that is Second World War. But now it may cross another step. This plan has to succeed. It has to be legible. I'm sorry that Ursula von der Leyen talks about amount of money, but she doesn't talk about project. Money is a means, but what do we do with it? How do we give to young people? The COVID generation cannot be the sacrificed generation in Europe. In France, there will be 700,000 young people who will come to the job market in September. That dimension should be the priority with the European Union. And I would like the President of the European Commission, I'd like her to talk not just about billions and means, but she should give us objectives. Tell the youth, okay, do we give them one more year to do study? Do we give them loans or grants? Do we create jobs in Europe so that employers would be incited to hire young people? Those are concrete questions with no answer for the time being, but I do hope sincerely that this plan will be voted in. We're the only continent to have adopted, to adopt decision at the majority, you know. So I hope that solidarity, sovereignty, those two pillars will be implemented. That's short term. That's for the summer. It should be done now. But which doesn't stop us from thinking about a second step. Of course, there will be projects, green plans, so on and so forth. I just want to talk about the values and the way Europe functions.
What makes Europe great is that it's based on values, freedom. Our continent is the one that enjoys the most freedom when we look elsewhere in the world, and those are real values that we need to protect. But it's not because we defend values that we need to sacrifice our interests. And I'd like Europe to transform itself in terms of power. I mean that I want it to prove capable of defending its own interests. Let me take a few examples. Let me give you 3 examples. Why does Europe accept extraterritoriality coming from US law? The EU is the leading commercial power in the world before China and the US. if, as the leading power, we should set the tone. We shouldn't suffer the extraterritoriality in U.S. law. This law is only voted by the American members of parliament. So this is a power struggle that Europe refuses to actually take part in. And when you refuse this power struggle, you end up neglecting your interests and thus neglecting the interests of your citizens. And that is really an issue. Second example, which to me is a very important matter. Europe has really so internalized that idea that the Commission, and I will give the benefit of the doubt to Ms. van der Leyen, but the most powerful directorate within the European Commission is the Competition Directorate. It was deemed more important than anything to have the rules of competition and the free flow of capital to the detriment of our industry. No continent, no country in the world has sacrificed its industry using the argument of competition being a prevailing concern. So I hope the competition commissioner will no longer be the ruler of the world, which has been the case up until now, which means, and the COVID crisis, of course, just an aside, the competition commissioner gives authorization on state aid. Of course, with the crisis, all of this is gone. Yes, because it was decided to help our industry, and the Commission endorsed that we needed to support our industry and that we could allow state aid. So, if there's one silver lining, is to say that we cannot organize the EU around the Competition Directorate. It should be replaced by industry, innovation, education, but we should close the door on that prevailing of competition. And one third example, and we were discussing it actually before this session started. When you do your reporting in terms of accounting, you have to record losses and benefits. Europe has agreed that the standards would be set by the US. So within the Commission that decided that, there wasn't a single European representative. I think that in terms of undermining yourself, we've really undermined our own interests, which means that and we have a finance expert here around the table that might want to step in, which means that we leave market share to US banks rather than defending our own interests. So I hope that in the light of this crisis, Europe will be able to say, I'll walk on my 2 feet. I will defend my own values because it is really the bedrock of Europe, of its history, of its construction. But it doesn't preclude being smart about it and acting as a power and defending our own interests. And one last point to wrap up in this introduction. This is based on the fact that we have interests and interests in common. So there needs to be a discussion between member states because member states don't always converge. And I could come back on this later. Well, thank you very much for this plea for a powerful Europe that will be music to the ears of many of its proponents. Guillaume FAURY, you are the Airbus CEO, Airbus, the European company par excellence, and the ones that is able to compete with an American giant, Boeing. But at the same time, you are hit hard by this crisis. I think you said that there has been a 40% drop in your business performance. So how can Europe face the challenges of history? Pretty simple question, really. Well, I didn't discuss this with Valérie RABAULT beforehand, but I have to say that I agree with quite a lot of what she said. So I'm going to elaborate on some of the points she's developed. Indeed, the COVID-19 crisis hit aerospace, but also other sectors, tourism that depends on aerospace and air traffic, and it's hit them hard. And we have not recovered yet in terms of air traffic. Air traffic figures are still very low, minus 5% of passengers, less than 5% of passengers worldwide actually travel at the moment. And on the domestic market, we are somewhere between 10 and 30%, 40% at most, compared to levels pre-crisis. So in 2020 and 2021, in terms of our delivery of aircrafts, there's been a drop of 40%, which means that, but this actually is assuming that in terms of traffic, we go back to the pre-crisis level by summer 2021. If it is not the case, we should expect a second wave of pretty negative announcements and bad news. So the situation in our sector is very serious indeed. We should all be aware of this. And in such a situation, we need players that have the critical mass that enables them to make decisions on the conditions of stoppage of traffic, but also how to kickstart traffic again. And with the OSCE, based in Montreal, where all countries get together to make decisions, and with Yalta, and with the ASA, which is the Aviation Security Agency, with set rules. And I think we've done too much in terms of health measures so that we could be sure to do enough. So, flight bans and stoppages were not coordinated enough around Europe. Nations were very protective. And it took too much time, but the recovery seems to, the kick-starting, starting again seems to be more coordinated. So if these decisions are robust enough, then we will have achieved something. Then there'll be the starting of business outside of Europe, and I hope that Europe will be able to voice, to really have a voice. Certain countries deciding whether they're going to have flights to another country again. We can't do that in isolation. So we are challenged by a situation that is highly unusual, and that requires coordination and the capacity to decide together. In the situation of a crisis, you need a certain agility, you need a flexibility, but we need one center for decision making, and this has demonstrated the weaknesses of Europe. But I'd like to open up that debate on the positive aspects. It has been said before that Europe was built thanks to a number of crises, because in a crisis you find that you're capable of doing what you wouldn't have hoped being capable to do. So Europe was built, and Airbus is one of our strengths, is that we're based on partnerships and cooperation. We work together, we respect one another, and we work at the service of common good. And I think it's something that European citizens do not maybe value enough, how important it is to work together, and how much Europe is a space for freedom and prosperity. There are other players, the US and China, that do not serve a common good. Their aim is domination, and they want to rule the world. They think they have the capacity to question pre-existing leadership, and we have those two big powers that make daring choices and are able to make trade-offs. And in Europe, we're not agile enough to do that. What are our values? Of course, our values are the basis for our identity, but we have to serve our interests. And unfortunately, in this power struggle on a global scale, when multilateralism is under attack, and what used to ensure regulation and that everybody abided by the law, Europe needs to assert itself. It needs to be more of a power and not be content with its sovereignty and independence, but redefine the role it wants to play in the world. And by redefining that role, Europe will redefine the way it operates in Europe, because this requirement of unanimity and getting everyone to agree on something is actually something that hinders the way Europe operates. So we need to reinvent ourselves. Right. Thank you very much. I'm sure Margot WALLSTRÖM will probably have something to say in response to what you've said. Yves Perrier, you are the finance expert, aforementioned finance expert here. How do you envisage the role that finance, your sector, could play in this major European milestone and in this reinventing that is needed? I'll answer your question, but I'd like to start by picking up on this question of Europe as a power, which is really the crucial question. Europe was not built to become a power historically. It was built to share common values, to be a big market, but it did not think of itself as a potential big power playing its role to the full. So so this idea of independence and the strategic implications existed before COVID. I think there are three reasons why we need to ask ourselves these questions. I think the center of gravity of the world has shifted. 30 years ago, 20% of world population lived in the Western world, Europe and the US, and that represented over 60% of GDP. Nowadays, it's 15% of the population and 1/3 of the GDP. So the center of gravity has shifted to new powers. Second reason is the evolution of the US. The US do not want and cannot be that hyperpower, as Hubert Védrine has called it, that would organize the world, and it is no longer a beacon in terms of values and culture. And lastly, third question, it's the challenge of energy transition and recovery. Why is the question of financial systems important and the control of the European financial system by Europeans? Why is it a major challenge? Because faced with this challenge, we'll have to finance investments and infrastructure. Energy transition, you know, what's at stake is that we need to finance new infrastructures. Let me remind you that since 2007, 2008, the degree of investment in infrastructures in Europe went from 3% to 2.5% of GDP only. Secondly, we need to give the capacity to European companies to have more weight in worldwide competition. And I think that Europe beyond its values is defined by a social market economy. And thirdly, and lastly, a financial system is actually a vector for values, both economic and social values. And to have control over it, I think three changes are necessary. First, mobilizing European savings and gear it towards a European company. Nowadays, less than 10% of European savings is invested in shares. 30% of American savings are invested in shares, in the capital of companies, that is. And which means that a big chunk of the capital of European companies is in the hands of American investment funds. So there's a lot of talk about a more responsible capitalism, a capitalism that would be more aware of its social environment, but there cannot be any such thing as responsible capitalism in Europe if there isn't a European shareholding. Because at the end of the day, managers of a company have to be accountable to those who are its shareholders. And my next point, you mentioned it, Valérie, is the control on financial standards, accounting standards, of course. I'll come back to that. So ESG, environment, social, and governance. About accounting standards, that's interesting. At the beginning of the noughties, there was a project to normalize European standards. But back then, Europe was reluctant or delegated its accounting standards to a supposedly independent organization, IAS, which actually has been funded by Americans. The idea was that it would make it possible to build universal standards, but they were never used by the Americans. So these standards, in terms of the framework of reference, were based on a financial capitalism listed in the stock exchange. Whereas in Europe we had a capitalism that was what was called the Rhineland model, and you cannot have a long-term efficiency. Now, a new topic is ESG. What does ESG mean? A company should not only be accountable to its shareholders in terms of its financial interests, which was the Friedman doctrine that has existed since the 1970s, but it is to serve the general interest, social issues, environmental issues. It is absolutely crucial for Europe to get its own set of references. And it used to be that we did not give much thought about this, but if you look at the American Roundtable last year, they've given it a lot more thought. And that declaration said companies need to be accountable to shareholders, but they should also serve the interests and values of American citizens.
So the question today is not to know if such sets of reference will be used by investors, but the content thereof. that will be behind that. And this is this point which is being discussed. It's called the taxonomy in Brussels, but it is a key element. A third point, a third evolution, has to do with the circulation of capital markets. Ever since the crisis of the Eurozone in 2011, in fact, the European market became fragmented. Money there's less circulation or flow of money between countries. And in some cases, in fact, European savings, which is quite abundant actually, Europe as a trade surplus is being invested in the US and not in Europe. So the reform of capital markets, the project we call a capital market union, should in fact should have as an objective the ability to have this circulation of capital, and savings from Nordic countries should be invested to make it possible to develop countries of the South. And France belongs to that group, because if we don't do so, economic divergence between states or discrepancies between states we have increased significantly ever since the creation of the euro, unlike what we thought at the time, which have been further aggravated following the Eurozone crisis, will continue becoming graver after the COVID, and this could be very, very dangerous for Europe. So roughly, this is the financial system, is to the economy what the blood system is in the human body. The blood is circulating. Well, make sure that you control your blood system, your arteries and veins. It's a key element for the future of Europe. Thank you very much, Yves Perrier, for this clarification. Very lucid, very clear vision about the functions of the financial system and what it can provide to the construction. Margot WALLSTRÖM, I think we'd like to hear you now about this kind of a French unanimity around the table. So about the way Europe is being, well, the way we would like Europe to be. It should fight for itself, fight for its interest. And, we've seen it in the last couple of months, 2 months, basically. Well, there's done a lot of, covered a lot of road in public debate, but also in Europe. So from Sweden, and I know you have a rather different position stand, how do you assess the evolution?
Well, thank you, and thank you for all of these contributions to and very important arguments to a debate about how we build back better, as it is called. When the European Council of Foreign Relations asked and made a survey to Europeans, they found that Europeans in general actually want more cooperation and expect also more sovereignty from the European side, and that they thought also that there was evidence of European solidarity so far. I think that when we come out of this acute sort of crisis, we have a few things that we simply have to do. They are unavoidable, they are inevitable, and the first thing is, of course, to address climate change. And it is clear that this also offers enormous opportunities for Europe with our technology, with our knowledge and expertise, and I think also with some of the systems that we have put in place. So I really value the fact that the European Union has come together on a Green Deal and on a frame for addressing climate change. It is also clear that we will have to defend, as several of you have said, we will have to defend the basic structures of our society and our role in the world by defending systems for free trade, for competition, rules for competition, multilateralism as such, coming together in different international bodies to try to solve problems, and agree on this, and to defend democracy and democratic values and everything that is the foundation of the European Union. And it has to become solutions united, as we've said many times. The European Union is, as you've said, it's a sort of social market economy. It has to be relevant to citizens, and they have to understand and feel that they have a say, that they can see that their interests are taken care of when it comes to precarious jobs, or making sure that young people can, of course, find jobs and all of that, or travel or study as they can now in Europe. So we will have to be in everything we do. We have to come closer to citizens so that they feel this is their project. But the economy has to, we have to bring the economy and all of these important companies back on track, and make sure that that we can also serve our economic interests. And remember, we can no longer trust, not at least not as long as President Trump is there. We can no longer trust the United States of America as an ally and a partner, as we have been able to until now. But we will also have to very much fight for our own interests, and maybe even use another kind of language towards the US. And that's a very sad fact right now, because we would have needed the US as a partner also to defend some of these very important structures that ensures that every company, every citizen, every consumer, every young person will know what the sort of conditions are and what the opportunities are in a Europe that must come back stronger and must cooperate and make sure that that we are credible and trustworthy. And we have to agree on a number of solutions, including those on migrants and how to deal with crisis situations as we've had.
Pardon.
Actually, you talk about the need to use another language vis-à-vis the US. You thinking about trade, but do you think this other language could apply to defense?
Et de la sécurité.
I think it will. I don't think that it will affect NATO, or I doubt that somebody will sort of want to back out of NATO. But already NATO is also in a kind of crisis where you cannot really rely on the US as being steadfast in playing its role in NATO. And I think there will be a discussion about how to define security and Europe's security, and probably more countries will also look after their own system, their own defense, and they will define it in a wider way. But of course, this whole crisis, the pandemic, started in a very sad way also, where countries, I don't say what country actually sort of just looked after its own interest to begin with, and did not share. And I know that we are also seen as the odd man out in fighting the pandemic, but we have to make sure that we have rules and a kind of understanding of what European solidarity means also in crisis situations. And maybe that's the lesson learned from this. And some mistakes have been made, but then we have to do better.
Merci beaucoup.
Many thanks. We have quite a few questions already from our listeners or internet users, participants. I don't know how to call them in the new format, but I'm getting them on my screen. And I have a few for myself, and you probably have some for you. Valérie RABAULT, one of our listeners, asks, why do you reproach the Commission for abiding by the treaty? Well, that listener is right, actually. Can you explain your position? Well, competition is enshrined in the treaty, so dura lex, sed lex. So we have to abide by the treaty, but that does not preclude observing that we haven't always defended our interests. And by our interests, I don't mean French interests, German interests, or Swedish interests, but the interests of Europe in itself. But maybe Europe does not think of itself as Europe. In the treaty, there's talk of free movement, but it is within the European continent. Europe has never taken the step to think of itself as a power compared with the rest of the world. So that's the first topic. Maybe we need to change that. We need to evolve on that. I think there's a lot to be gained to take a step forward. But I think, nonetheless, that when you defend competition, you defend consumers to the detriment of producers. You can spin it the way you like. This is what it amounts to in economic terms. And I do not agree that Europe should put consumers first to the detriment of producers. I can see it in France. Of course, Airbus is a great counterexample of that. But nonetheless, in our in the business that creates the added value, we've suffered the consequences of that doctrine. And I think, and that's my personal view, to answer that listener, that the way the Competition Directorate has interpreted the treaties was a bit too maximalist. I could give you many examples. I'd rather what has been done with Margot Vestager. I'd like Europe to use its firepower to go beyond the European borders to unlawful or disloyal competition. We saw that with the fine given to Google. So I would have liked Europe to put more resources into doing that. It is important, of course, to red flag that there's been disloyal competition, but we should use our firepower to build some European champions, and we should make sure that it benefits our SMEs. I don't think this has been done sufficiently. So to answer your listener, I think the Commission could have done things differently and has pushed the treaty a bit too far. The crisis is actually pushing in your direction. Angela Merkel, in her press conference with Emmanuel Macron on May the 18th, said she wished for European champions and that we had been too naive. So I think she's actually pointing to the same direction you are. So we'll see what that takes us, but we can see where you're headed and what your point is. Advocating for a policy that could help a real European industry and real European industrial champions to emerge. The only champion I can think of was Airbus, and that was 50 years ago. Guillaume FAURY. A listener asks, I think it picks up on part of what you said before. Is attack the best defense for Europe. And it's true that you've had very strong words. You said, common good is all well and good, and in Europe we are guided by that common good, but there are other powers that are led by other principles, which is that of domination. So should we adopt the same rationale? How can we fight and make it a level playing field when we fight with people who have a completely different rationale? Well, I didn't mean to advocate for aggressiveness or aggression, because I agree with what we said about values. I don't think we should relinquish our values, but I'm thinking of international partners and international powers who want to exert a certain form of domination. And this is not a level playing field. They are not kind to the prospect of European champions emerging. They see that as a risk. So we have to be more assertive. There's an expression that says, at equal power, being intransigent and being strong-minded can actually pay off. So we look for a compromise. If our opponent is not looking for a compromise and is looking for every way to impose the solution that is good for them, well, that's when values are not enough. And I think post-COVID, we are in an even more fragmented world where people tend to isolate because there are essential needs that are no longer met. And so we tend to want to protect ourselves first and foremost, be it to the detriment of others. And Europe is even more torn and fragmented than it was before. So I am not advocating for aggression. No, I am part of an international company and we work with a lot of other countries. We have footholds in the US and China, and we are a European country with European values, and we operate smoothly in the US and in China because of those values. But I think we need to be more ambitious. Coming back to the idea of competition, it's not about only making for more fairness in Europe, but to have a competitiveness agenda for Europe. And sometimes it can be difficult. We have a few national champions. Let's say we have 5, and we want to bring 3 together to create a world champion. What's going to happen to the other 2? It will be to their detriment. Well, in Europe, with a European set of rules, it will not happen. So nothing is black or white. Often we have to make the best possible decisions for the greatest number of people, but it can't be for all. There are, of course, we do not want these trade-offs to be to the detriment of smaller countries that have less influence in Europe, but we have to defend the interest of the majority. We have to have a political vision of the world that reflects what the world is today. And I think this is a challenge for Europe to face up to and to rise to. Yves Perrier, we were discussing power and I think it's Valérie RABAULT who mentioned extraterritoriality, which is a major challenge for Europe and for European companies, for the sovereignty of Europe and for the companies that are penalized by that extraterritoriality rule. You asked earlier, why are we not reacting? Why are we not rebelling? Well, I think the best tool to counterbalance that is to have a currency that can rival the dollar. So do you think it's an option? Is it realistic to think that the euro can compete with the dollar? Listening to you all, I thought of a phrase by Marc Gabriel, former German minister, said that we are herbivores in a world of carnivores, in Europe. It's not about being aggressive, but you have to see the world as it is. We are present in 40 countries, and my company is. And when I go to the US, I totally understand that the US defends the US interests. When I go to China, I have no doubt that China will defend its interests. Same for Japan. And in a way, Russia and the British will defend their interests. So, wouldn't be absurd that Europe be the only continent not to defend its own interests. Yes, values matter, but we saw what's happened, and it was not enough. So let me pick up on this point. Financial system is also an instrument of power. American power over the last 70 years, but all the more so more recently, has been based on an economic, military power. But financial system is a tool for power. Remember in 1971 when Nixon put an end to the convertibility of dollar in gold because of the Vietnam-related debt? Well, so controlling our financial system is essential to have a strategic autonomy. It's an American Secretary of State that was talking about deficit and said, the dollar is our currency, it is our problem. And all central banks have actually acted in support. And what the ECB has done was great, but compared to what the Fed has done, it was not enough. So can the ECB go on because divergences between countries make it weaker? Nobody's wondering whether the Fed will go on with its work. So before we even discuss extraterritoriality, having control over your financial system is a must. The euro is an important currency because it is the largest economic area in the world, but it is not a reserve currency. And it will become a reserve currency once there is no doubt anymore that Europe is a power. And in China, when they ask themselves the question of the euro and in other parts of the world, they wonder whether the euro is going to prove long-standing. Is it really a whole that is an entity that is going to prove sustainable? And, in the banking sector, we are well placed to know what extraterritoriality is. There have been record fines. And the Americans maybe have reminded us that we had a nationality on that day. But it wouldn't come to my mind that, but they would never imagine that we could do the same to them. Because we've come to terms, we've accepted their domination. And, the biggest banks are American. In the top 10, in the finance sector, top 10, 9 American companies. And Amundi is a European company that is also has footholds in China. So we need to have players that can compete with these big players. But political authorities need to support us. You talked about sanctions against Iran today. Well, most companies have accepted the rules. But if most of your shareholders are American, of course you have to abide by American rules. That brings us back to the question of power. We only have a few minutes left, and I would like to ask you, Margot WALLSTRÖM, you talked of the importance of the recovery plan, the crucial importance of that plan that is being negotiated as we speak. Your country is one of the 4 frugal countries. Very briefly, because we have very little time left, very briefly, how do you estimate the chances of that plan of being voted in with a few modifications, but in the principle and the qualitative leap that it constitutes? Do you think it will be voted in?
I do. I'm optimistic, and I think it will have to be a compromise, as always with this. Can I just, in this debate about big powers and what the world will look like when it is no longer only 2 sort of superpowers, I want to remind everyone what happens in a system that is not a rules-based system. Because I come from a country that has been totally dependent on free trade, on making sure that we can cooperate with other countries, and of course have become a wealthy country because we have been open and have had this access to a big market and being able to trade, and that we can build it on rules that are accepted and created by countries. And I really think that this is, we have to reflect on what is the alternative. Well, only the big and powerful will, of course, grab power in such a system. So we have to defend what we have, and we have to refine it, and we have to, of course, improve it. But let's be careful with those structures that we have built. And I think that there will be a deal, and as I said, I'm glad that as a base, as a kind of base for this is also the Green Deal, and the fact that we have to do everything, take every step now towards dealing with the effects of climate change, but also think of it as an enormous economic and social opportunity for our societies. And that is also the way to make sure that we prevent catastrophes like this one, like a pandemic, and another one that is a zoonosis, which means that it's
Merci beaucoup. Oui, pardon, je suis désolée, nous sommes à la...
Sorry, we're coming very near the end, and I wanted to give just a minute to Françoise for a conclusion. Just a few quick words. I think there are 5 takeaways from this discussion. The need for Europe, it's negotiations that are indispensable in transport and either. Europe as a power. We want a powerful Europe, an ambitious power, a credible Europe. Financing investment, control over our financial system. Europe should be a Europe of values, but no longer naive. Without values, there is no Europe, but Europe should not. It should not be to the detriment of its own interests. And finally, responsible Europe. We've talked too briefly of the question of the young generations because it is absolutely essential. It is with the young people that we will pull through. Thank you very much. Apologies, Ms. WALLSTRÖM, for interrupting, but I think your message got across. And many thanks to the panelists here, Valérie RABAULT, Yves PERRIER, Guillaume FAURY. I thought there was a fascinating debate. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Thank you very much.